Welcome back. In the previous segment, the discussion on GST provided knowledgeable opinions on its implementation. In this segment, we bring to you an insightful discussion on governance.
What I understand is TCS is owned 75% by the Tata Group. And how does it actually make the distinction between ownership and management, and how does it operate?
You know, if you look at, of course, it is substantially owned by the group, 75%. But if you look at the structure of governance, other than Mr. Ratan Tata, there is no one from Bombay House on the board. Of course, Ram is the vice chairman, and then 3 of us are executive directors who have been working with TCS. The other 5 directors are totally independent directors, and 4 of the 5 don't even live in India. They live outside. And therefore, it has been maintained as totally a separate entity, organization, which still derives benefit from what happens with the group.
In context of a family business, how independent is actually a board, and what does your group do to actually maintain independence of the board?
Yeah, again, I think independence of the board is a relative issue, because take, for example, Tata board, as was just mentioned, or take Reliance Communications. The only family member and the only member representing the company is Mr. Ambani himself. All the other members on the board are independent. It's a 5-member board. You have 4 independent directors and 1 director representing the family. So clearly, in that sense, there's fair degree of independence. I think it's again a question of, as you rightly said, how do you distinguish between ownership and management? How do you allow the independent directors to function? What level of transparency do you have? And so on. And all of that, as rightly put down, is ultimately relative. It depends on the individuals concerned. Whom have you selected? How are they looking at it? How do they perform their role? And we find, for example, at least in most of our companies, the independent directors play a very significant part in, I would say, directing or trying to direct the way in which the company is going forward, with leaving it to the management to do what it likes, and yet trying to guide them to some extent. And that's exactly what the role of an independent director is. And we have found that across the board, whether it is capital, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's communications. So I would think that we have been able to achieve it by a very proper and judicious selection of the independent directors. And after all, it's the individuals which really make the distinction at that level.
Mr. Shungu, this is a question for you. See, the government actually is planning a plethora of disinvestments, like even though they are stock market listings of, say, up to 10%. And government companies follow a different norm of corporate governance altogether. And if the valuations of these companies were to even increased by the premium on corporate governance, what do you think the government should do before disinvesting, or before these stock market listings?
Well, I don't know whether government would be able to do much before or in what period of time. But clearly there has to be a roadmap for government to strengthen corporate governance. One part of that is that, and without any reflection at all on the private sector and within courts, the so-called independent directors in government have to be differently selected. Arguably, there are a large number of shareholders who are private individuals. Some of that is beginning to happen. I think they should be able to really throw up in a process of election restricted to them directors who are truly independent. So that would be one very specific thing in which the board can be strengthened, and if the board is strengthened, corporate governance would be strengthened.
Mr. Mahalingam, this one's for you. See, Tatas have taken this for granted. There is that CSR and value and ethics is a part of doing business. But, research has actually not necessarily conclusively proved that and made that correlation even today. What's your view on this? I mean, is CSR a worthwhile investment?
That's not a question that gets asked within in our boards, because Tata's have been, as a group, has been around for 140 years. or thereabouts. And I think this is something that is that they have seen it all, and over a period of time, it is definitely, obviously, benefited, and they have taken this as a responsibility. So it has become a way of life as far as CSR is concerned. The only issue that comes in is what do we do and what do we have the group do. And in our case, we essentially focus on education, whether it is adult literacy or whether it is bringing technology to education or something. And there we could do that. But the other things get done by the trust themselves, and we help to the extent. Of course, they are also owners of TCS, so to that extent, they get benefit from whatever, however we do that.
Family businesses always have this issue about succession planning, and that's been an issue that's especially in old families that's created issues and erosion of value. To any family, what advice would you give them for them to actually have a better succession planning?
It's been something which is very difficult to resolve. I have been involved in a number of, in my practicing career and in my career in industry, I've been involved in various family matters in that sense, and I've seen it over time. And you see, where you are ultimately concerned with personal egos, a lot of time, common sense, the best of the company, all that perhaps takes a back seat. And it's very difficult when you're dealing with people and their egos to be able to bring them back to see some rationality. But that's something which you really need to achieve. If you can bring in a sense of rationality, I don't think it's very difficult to really achieve succession planning in a family business. Perhaps you can do much better. One has seen a fair amount of change, I would think, in the last 3 to 5 years. At least that's what I have noticed, I would think, in the last 3 years. Many more families now wanting to plan in advance than the number of families who were doing it earlier as to how they will resolve possible disputes in the future, what will happen to succession. Have they really found answers? I would really think no. Almost invariably, we've been able to document it better trusts, better wills, better ways of being able to give the rights between various parties. But ultimately there has to be an element of subjectivity. There has to be an element where one of the members of the family can do something which will hurt the others or hurt somebody else, and it's very difficult to get over that. So I think ultimately it's a question of training, it's a question of education, it's a question of bringing home to them the fact that rationally it makes most sense for them to come together on issues of succession than to separate. And if you can achieve that, I think succession planning should not really be difficult.
The PricewaterhouseCoopers CFO Conclave aimed at expanding the knowledge base of leading finance professionals on some of the most critical issues facing businesses today, with a variety of subjects and issues being discussed in addition to the participation of distinguished guests. The first edition of the CFO Conclave seemed to have visibly achieved its set goal.